Hello, very beautiful community. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and we'll take quite a while today, so skip this or buckle in, because this will only be 20% analytical, and it'll be 80% about grounding ourselves epistemically, and also sort of reassuring ourselves about our better instincts still being okay, even if things are sometimes unlovely or yucky around us in our informational environment as Western citizens who are interested in global politics, but also Western citizens who want to keep their democracies, who also want to keep themselves not just being effective as citizens, but who want to be effective citizens without feeling terrible about themselves all the time. So we'll look at a couple of pops, happen to be pops at me, but they are things that we will look at really by dissolving them, by de-algorithmatizing our response to them. And one's a sort of toxic pop, and one's not a toxic pop. One is a pop at the video on the main channel about the breakup of Russia, which I shared a few months ago. And that's a pop that comes from the Free Nations of Russia forum. So let's begin before we do more grounding and a bit of analysis, including some analysis about the breakup of Russia. So that'll be 20% of our chat. But before we go further, let's just say a couple of things first. At the moment I'm talking to you a bit on the edge. I'm always talking to you by finding moments when my health is up to it. I won't give a health update in this video. That'll be somewhere on the ME Diary channel in the next couple of days. I won't get into the invalid traffic issue that the channels are facing at the moment. But I will say this, that there is also a bit of an advantage with me speaking to you when I'm, needing to push through and when I may be less coherent. And that's a kind of ethical rawness that I think is actually constructive, right? It's nothing like what would happen if somebody told me I only had 6 months of YouTube videos left to make, because that's not how I'm thinking at all. But if hypothetically that happened due to some personal challenges to do with health that I faced, I would be extremely raw in how I'm present with you, and I could actually do a lot of positive work together with you, even if I were less coherent. So from that point of view, I'm actually persuaded by it being absolutely fine to speak. And sometimes you have to indulge me that things we can do in 20 minutes we end up doing in 40. There are two things I feel that are very important, and I find them hard to share because I'm developing as a baby public intellectual, and it's part of my development that I learn how to share them. I have a certain style of communication that's okay for intellectual stuff, but it's not okay for public intellectual stuff, so I'm always learning, and you're helping me learn. One thing I feel that is very important is that I want to tell you that it's okay, that politics is okay. And the second thing I feel is a real responsibility to be positive. Not to be positive sort of fatuously, not to be positive by fabricating things, right? Not to be positive about, let us say, the chances of a Trump defeat in November. I don't like being positive about that. I like to place us wherever I think that balance of uncertainties and probabilities is. But I feel a real responsibility to be positive at a time when I myself have a lot of positive thoughts and emotions about the social world, about the political world, and just about us, right? The extraordinary situation of these weird animals that we are living under culture in the deep way that we do. And it's not easy to share, because when you share that, it can sound kitsch or sentimental. And so I'm exploring that, right? I'm exploring what it means to exercise this responsibility that I have as an infinitesimal public intellectual to say, you know, anything of importance that I feel that's positive about the social and political world, it's important to share, given not just how much unhappiness there is behind every tweet or every post you come across on a social media platform much of the time, but also how much unfreedom there is behind it, right? How much people are just robotically going through motions of slapping slogans to counteract other slogans and so on. We'll talk about that. So this need to be positive is something I feel deeply, and I'm exploring how to articulate it more. So let's look at a couple of pops. And what we'll do is begin dissolving them. Now, the first pop is from an account that belongs to the Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum. And I say something about these sorts of organizations in my main channel video on the breakup of Russia. And that account says, this video, the main channel breakup of Russia video, is an example of the Kremlin's classic soft power. Through an infiltrated network, Chekists promote their own narratives in NATO and EU countries, unfortunately. So we'll come back a couple of times from that. I don't regard that as a toxic comment. I regard that as a somewhat depoliticized comment and a somewhat self-refuting comment, perhaps, because it makes an accusation about an unthinking position, happens to mirror some Kremlin narratives, when it addresses itself to a thinking position while itself not being a thinking position. And now let's take a look at a toxic pop. This is just from a random account, but it's important because there's a lot of, a lot of commentary that trends in that direction. It's healthy to be sort of transparent about it being there. Every Russian is ontologically evil, including Vlad Vexler. Now, obviously the commenter would embarrass themselves if we asked them what the word ontological meant, whether it was necessary, what work it was doing in that line. But we'll address ourselves to that more toxic pop first, and we'll do it in a way that is nourishing for us, right? Not by having a go at some toxic stuff written online. So what's this "every Russian is evil" slogan all about? Let's talk about it constructively. Let's start personally. How Russian is this one? How Russian is this person? It's a question that I often ask about Isaiah Berlin, about whom I'm meant to be writing a book. And Berlin moved in 1921 from Latvia/Petrograd to England at the age of 12. I left the USSR at the age of 9 in 1990. And I've always believed that Isaiah was more Russian than me. And I think partly that's a difference of these 3 years that are so important, right? Imagine 9 versus 12 is an enormous difference. But partly it's also a difference of personalities. And I hope at some point I will say, whether in the book, if it'll ever come on Berlin or elsewhere, what I think about Berlin's own Russianness. And Berlin was a very important essayist. My acquaintance Brian McGee often called Berlin, together with George Orwell, the greatest essayist in English in the 20th century. While Berlin was clearly more Russian than me, in my view, it would be a mistake to say that he was Russian. because he's clearly more Western and more Central European psychologically than he is Russian, and by quite a long way. Think about it again, 12. And being Russian means two things. One, it's a question of how psychologically Russian you are. That really applies to any question of how Australian you are, how, French you are. And two, how far you feel a belonging by association. You might feel about your own background. Oh, I was born there, and that means something to me independently of having any kind of psychology, right? I mean, if you were born in Tunisia, but you got taken away at the age of 6 months, you ain't going to be very Tunisian. But you could still kind of identify, because, gosh, that's where I was born, and that sort of means something, and I have a relation of association, even if I don't have a relation of shared psychological qualities that might be a feature of that culture. One of the people I love very much, in fact, I rate him as one of the two greatest moral philosophers of the past 70 years, is Richard Wollheim, who died in 2003, which was a very fatal year for philosophers. And it was also when an up-and-coming philosopher got chronically sick. And Richard was skeptical of national traits cutting deep. You know, the Greeks are like this, the Danes are like that. But I myself do take that idea more seriously. And for me, taking it more seriously is a consequence of a notion that philosopher, Richard Wollheim, and pretty much anybody, has to accept. And that is that the degree to which human beings live under culture cuts deep, right? There's a profound degree to which we have a universal psychology, but living under culture cuts deep. Now, you're already beginning to appreciate how we're dissolving the toxic comment here, right? So I've already got too philosophical by a couple of steps, so we need to be careful. And therefore, let me share a sort of a rule of thumb about what it means to feel at home in a culture. And it's in terms of this question: how alone would you feel if you could only communicate in the language of that culture? The more alone you feel relative to other languages you have or might use, the less you belong to that culture. Now, for me, if somebody said that I had to speak Russian, that would feel like a cultural devastation had taken place. It would feel like my own culture had died. And that's not because primarily my Russian is limited, which it is, right? I mean, I've never given a philosophical talk in Russian. I've never read anything in Russian since the age of 9, except for things that I had to read in Russian. In other words, there's some bits of Russian literature that you've got to read in Russian. But that's about it. I mean, I haven't read a single philosophical text in Russian in my life. Partly it's because I don't regard the social and political texts, the great texts of the 19th century in Russia, such as the writings of Alexander Herzen, as philosophical texts. But it's not that. It's more importantly the issue that my character is not translatable into Russian. It's not expressible in Russian without loss of some of the things that matter most, that are most constitutive to it. So very crudely speaking, what we've got here isn't an expression of the limitation of my Russian, but is a reflection of the gap between Western Europe and Russia. There's quite a big cultural gap between Western Europe and Russia, and I'm here, basically. Yeah. So what could it mean to be more Western than Russian? What are these differences all about? And again, we can only be cartoonish here. The difference is about degrees of self-consciousness. There are differences in degrees of collectivism versus individualism and how you think about everything from buying oat milk to political organization. There are differences in terms of things like openness to contradiction. We could carry that list on for an hour. In his biography of Berlin, unless I'm making this up, I'm getting this from elsewhere, I think Michael Ignatieff, who is Canadian but has family generations coming from pre-revolutionary Russia. And he said in the biography that one of the funny Russian qualities that Berlin had was not answering a question and then answering it. That's to say, that's when somebody is asked in the morning, how do you feel about this? They don't want to answer. They're asked in the afternoon, how do you feel about this? They don't want to answer. They're asked in the evening the exact same question, suddenly they want to answer and they answer. And Michael was saying that that's a distinctively Russian quality, because if you ask a Brit or a Dane, they're going to say, well, I either want to answer it or I don't, but morning versus evening and my differences of mood, there ain't going to make a difference. Either I'm open about talking about something or I'm not. So, here via this example, we're beginning to taste cultural difference. Now, we run into a thorny corner. Understanding a culture and belonging to it cannot be completely separated, though they can be separated very far. And so the internality of my own understanding of Russian culture is at least one indication of my partial belonging to it. But given how alien all of this is to me, how do I belong to it? Well, there are going to be some very minor relations of association. Well, I'm born there, so that creates a kind of engagement, right? That creates, for instance, a feeling, well, I'm born there, I'm associated a bit with some of the politics there, even though none of the political emotions I feel are about Russian stuff. They're all about Western stuff. I mean, the Iraq War or Brexit is, of 50-fold greater emotional proximity to me than anything to do with Russia. But nevertheless, because I'm born there, yeah, I am going to have certain feelings about the war, for example, that I wouldn't have if I were born in New Zealand. Now, they don't manifest very much in my conversations because my identity as a philosopher just absorbs them. They don't, right? They don't come out. But if they were to come out, you'd see them more. It would express, for example, in a very viscerally pro-Ukrainian attitude toward kicking the Russians out, right? You don't feel that because it's absorbed in the fact that my responses to politics, my responses to the social world sort of filter through my identity, my character really as a philosopher. And that means that these sort of differences of impulse are not going to be at the forefront. You could fish for them. So, of course, how far a small part of one's identity is a part of one's identity isn't a fixed number. I can't say I'm 10% Russian psychologically. It's always a matter of exploration, and often these percentage points don't help because it could be that really everything you look at about yourself is Western. It might be in my case, but there could be some inflections of these Western properties that has a bit of a Russian shading or a bit of an East European shading or whatever. This immediately raises a paradoxical question about the line, all Russians are evil. A Ukrainian, even a Ukrainian from Western Ukraine, will be closer, far, far closer to Russians psychologically than I am. And this will be true to a lesser extent even about some East European countries. And this is a disastrous conclusion for the all Russians are evil argument, as applied to my particular case, as whatever the truth of its conclusion about me, the same truth has to be 10 times truer of Ukrainians. And that, of course, defeats the purpose of the argument. Now, what if the argument migrates to it's your ethnic makeup that matters? That's not a solid place, really, for the argument because of all the obvious reasons, but then the less obvious reason that in my case, I am way more Polish and Ukrainian than I'm Russian ethnically, according to 23andMe at least. Then the argument might need to revert to it's where you're born that matters. And here it has really run aground because it has very rapidly ended up in a confusion between the various ways we could talk about the character of a person and virtue where they come from. One way of talking about it could be biological. And here is really the place where this argument tries to reach for, but there is nothing to reach for there because in terms of anybody's biology, anybody's biological makeup, nothing political can be said. There are only two places left to reach. One is cultural explanation, cultural features, and social explanation. Now, cultural explanation is explanation that is particular to a culture. Social explanation is explanation that is about things that are going on in the culture that we can understand in terms of similar things going on in other cultures. So, for instance, if we talk about why does an X number of Russians support Putin's war, the cultural explanation would be their various mythologies about politics, and here we could contrast a certain kind of deference to a monarchical figure with some kind of a more rebellious political mythology you find in Ukraine. We'd be talking about cultural difference. But then we could also be talking about sociological or social explanation, which would take us to questions like, well, to what extent does a population generally support an aggressive war when its country starts it? What could we say about that that is irrespective of cultural difference, right? So we've got some things we can say at the level of social explanation, at the level of cultural explanation, at the level of biology. And this argument really runs aground and becomes what you could call a kind of soft fascization. Soft fascization is when you exclude a category of human beings or rather when you exclude a group of human beings from an ethical category from which you can't exclude any human beings, right? Because the story about all Mongolians, all Japanese being evil would have to run through this biological, cultural, or social story, and there ain't a way of pulling it through there. Right? When I say something like, you know, Chinese people, obviously I don't mean this, are not suited for democracy. What's problematic here isn't that I've misunderstood Chinese people, but that I have said something about the group of human beings that can't be true of any group of human beings. I could say a particular culture militates against certain formations, political formations developing. That's much more reasonable. But that's not any longer the dependence on something like a biological claim that this sort of point ends up being dependent. So it just ends up in an epistemic conclusion, a confusion. Now, time for a bit of political analysis. Vlad's Breakup of Russia video says the account of the free nations of Russia is an example of the Kremlin's soft power through an infiltrated network. Chekists promote their own narratives in NATO and EU countries, unfortunately. Now, straight away, we have to understand that we don't want to react to comments defensively, right? Because when we think defensively, we just think about the impact of us. We don't think about the other person. And it's very important to think about the other person, whether they're behaving well or badly, what it's like for them. In a totally different conversation, if we talked about trauma, for instance, one of the biggest issues with trauma is that the traumatized party often can't three-dimensionally get inside the head of the perpetrator of the bad thing that happened to them, in virtue of their trauma. And that incapacity to enter into the head of the other side is going to be a perpetuation of the trauma. So we don't want to do that. So, you know, when we read something like this, it could be a grumpy 43-year-old boy writing it, kind of unsure about where they're going in their life, just at a career crossroads, not entirely fulfilled in their friendships. You see what I mean? You know, this is a 23-year-old girl. Okay, relationship with a mum, difficult relationship with a dad, a sibling who is really struggling. Caught in between a couple of university degrees, not sure where they want to go, a little bit confused about their sexuality. You know, am I heterosexual? Am I bisexual? That's where that comment, right? That's the background from which that comment is coming from. Therefore, unless it's a particularly terrible comment, you've got to approach it with a degree of gentleness and empathy. So before we get to that sort of stage, let's make a few analytical remarks about the breakup of Russia. You see, we're going all over the place, but I think it's like a multi-layered cake. It's okay. So I want to make 5 points now about the breakup of Russia analytically. 1, the view that Russia won't dissolve, which most experts share, is an interpretation. You sometimes get a bit of overreach here, and people say, Russia won't break up. Now, it's a compelling interpretation, and it is supported by many facts, but no set of facts makes it an obvious interpretation. In particular, it falls far short of being a prerequisite for seriousness. And sometimes it is placed as a prerequisite for seriousness, but then you'd end up in a situation where somebody like Alexander Etkind would be excluded for saying that he thinks Russia is going to break up. So you can't take this preponderance, if not a consensus among experts, and generate out of it a litmus test for seriousness in talking about this region. 1. 2, I'm going to say something the other way. The most frequently rehearsed arguments online, for instance, quote, colonized peoples all over Russia clamoring for independence, have a pop and activist quality. They're ill-informed, and they're frequently conditioned by algorithmic incentives on social media. Imagine if I changed my video, what are the odds of Russia breaking up, to Russia's breakup has begun, right? And then they themselves show a kind of colonial disregard for self-determination of people living on that space, right? We've got, Latvian scholars in Canada, I'm giving an actual example, talking about the breakup of a country that presumably needs to be run through, if we're going to talk about this being a legitimate process, the entitlement to self-governance of the people on that territory, right? They've got a say in what happens to them. Point 3, the fact that such arguments are weak doesn't mean that Russia won't break up. It may break up despite them. I regard this outcome as realistic. After Putin's project expires, much will depend on what political answers appear to the question, what holds Russian citizens together? Point 4. Russia's decolonization is a normatively impeccable enterprise, but it is fetishistic to equate it with a territorial fragmentation along arbitrary lines. The lines you see on all of these decolonization maps, interestingly, lines that got put there by the Kremlin. Territorial breakup, if it occurs, is likely to express not benign decolonization, but its failure, an unraveling following a failure of cultural and political decolonization. 5. If Russia were to break up, contrary to pop decolonization fantasies, that scenario is unlikely to go well. It's unlikely to proceed without wars, civil wars, mass refugee flows that are going to impact the region. So let's come back to this line. In this video, we've got an example of the Kremlin's soft power. Through an infiltrated network, Chekists promote their own narratives in NATO and EU countries, unfortunately. We already talked about, right, an accusation of an absence of free thought by a position that itself expresses an absence of free thought and depoliticization. What would immediately make such a comment political, in a way that it isn't, is if it addressed itself to a Russian audience rather than to a Western audience of algorithm-driven adulation. Right? Straight away, if you talked about this to Russians, you'd need to start with narratives like, we're being screwed over by the center, Moscow is screwing us over. You need to tap into the deep anti-central authority, anti-Moscow sentiment in Russia. That would be how you begin politicizing that. You'd think about facts like, hypothetical facts like the National Guard that got sent into Ukraine and did nasty things, being constituted of people, by folks who wouldn't be terribly against doing bad things if they got unleashed on the Moscow population, right? Plenty of resentment there, right? So I've already transferred this sentence into a political realm that you don't get with the discourse of organizations like that. And algorithmic response is about not thinking for yourself, but reacting to particular propositions with other propositions. So if you see apple strudel mentioned, you have to respond by saying Zakatort. And then if you're somebody who responds to apple strudel with Zakatort, every time you see eclair, you have to respond with carrot cake, and on it goes. It is a kind of a packaging of algorithmic responses. I see that, I do this. I see this, I do that. And much of our online discourse is algorithmically deterministic like that. And by the algorithm here, I don't mean the real algorithms. I mean the algorithm-like conduct of us, the keyboard typers, the mobile device pressers, looking at our screens. And there's a very important distinction here between thinking for yourself, not thinking for yourself, and thinking originally. Thinking originally is not a request. It's not an expectation that applies to any human unless they claim themselves to be a significant thinker, significant philosopher, and so on. But thinking for ourselves is something that everybody can do. And thinking for yourself doesn't mean being right, but it means not carrying around a sack of here is something I prepared earlier, and here is my sort of internal computer that is going to trigger me to pull one of these things out of my bag in a particular situation, right? What's going to be in my bag is a bit underdetermined, right? It's about adequately reacting to what you're presented with. And this is about two things. It's about a political thing and it's about a personal thing. Politically, it's enormously important because liberal societies only endure if they're tethered to the practiced virtue of truthfulness in a way that also ties in their public squares and their institutions. When we lose that, we leave our democracies out on a limb just with institutional checks and balances left to, resist the democratic erosion that will eventually break these checks and balances over a 20-year period. So this business of truthfulness is very important. It's very important that the problem with this algorithmic response, apple strudel, Zakatort, is that even if you get the issue right, you're wrong, right? So the algorithmic bounds here of our 23-year-old girl or 43-year-old boy from the Free Nations of Russia Twitter account is that every time they see something that implies that Russia won't break up, or if Russia breaks up, it'll be an extraordinary, unpredictable event that could harm Russia's neighbors and folks in the Russian space, won't end well. Boom, they have a pre-prepared response, right? That would be bad even if it were true that A, Russia's breakup is inevitable, and B, inevitably benign, right? If it were inevitable and inevitably benign, still going would be problematic. You wouldn't be thinking for yourself. You'd be right, but you'd be an unfree mind. An unfree mind that's right is a violation of this tetheredness to truthfulness that we're talking about. This is civically very important. And then there is something very important individually, personally, for you. There's a sacredness in thinking for yourself. A sacredness of respecting yourself digestively, respecting what you put into yourself and respecting what you put out there for others to put into them. And even if this is harder to do in our algorithmic environment, you don't win in this environment still. You don't really win by being popular. You still win by being free. And being free doesn't mean being right. Being free means having thought for yourself and not having imprisoned yourself with a sack full of predetermined, right, responses that are kind of robotic and just force you to pull out a slogan in response to some thought or some slogan that you encounter. So that respect for putting stuff into you can translate into your respect for what you put into others, right? And the thought here has to be, am I thinking freely? And if I am thinking freely and I'm saying something thinking freely, then putting these sorts of thoughts into ourselves is something that's going to feel not just good in the instant moment, but the next day. I can guarantee you that it is quite toxic for the person who has said that, every Russian is ontologically evil, including Vlad Vexler. It doesn't feel good. It's an unhappiness for them to not know what the word ontological means. It's an unhappiness for them to not have any capacity to keep apart biology from culture, from social explanation. It's an unhappiness with which you wake up the next day after putting that stuff into other stuff. It's because everything you say, you also are putting it into yourself, back into yourself too, right? So it's a kind of a violation of the sacredness of that person's respect for themselves as a citizen and for themselves as an individual to do this, right? It's really, they're doing a lot of self-administered negative stuff. And with the Free Nation story, it's not so toxic, but it's really the junk foodie depoliticization, where it just doesn't feel good doing politics when you kind of half of your mind understands that you're not really doing politics. You're not really doing politics. You're doing somewhat algorithm determined theatrics on the internet for an audience that has nothing to do with the audience you'd really be addressing if you wanted to shift things on the Russian space. So, all of that is still up to us. None of that has been robbed from us by our informational environment. And I'm enormously grateful for your indulgence of me, for 40 minutes here. Lots and lots of love. We'll have more robust analytical chats very soon.